In this video, we will explore who are the top 10 Starchitects in architecture and why. Starchitects are postmodern architects who try to be culturally relevant by being rock stars of architecture. Starchitecture is based on celebrity culture, consumerism, and the development of mass icons and symbols. Its corresponding movement is in pop art, where Robert Rauschenberg, Keith Haring, and Andy Warhol created iconic art for mass consumption. What makes a Starchitect? Formalism. Formalism focuses on the design of forms. A formalist creates sculptural shapes purely for the sake of making unique and interesting forms. The formalist creates their own personal style to create iconic works of architecture. The problem with this approach is architecture becomes a one-liner or purely an image. It may look good in photographs, but it doesn't necessarily create good environments. Conceptualism. Developing an architectural form through the use of concepts is a purely postmodern phenomena. Here, a concept is used to develop architecture, much like in abstract modern art. Starchitects, like other postmodernists, develop a concept that has nothing to do with the project and often comes from their own personal world of ideas and images. The entire project is organized around the concept. Theorizing. Many Starchitects use theory and philosophy, incorporating postmodern theory into their architecture. Zaha Hadid and Thom Mayne use deconstruction. Rem Koolhaus uses post-structuralism. Stephen Holl and Peter Zumthor use phenomenology. Most theories relate to postmodern philosophy of language, images, and social construction. Capitalism. Iconic works of architecture require huge amounts of money to build, so Starchitects must prostitute themselves to the capitalist machine. Clients get world-class iconic works of architecture as a brand or as a tourist attraction. Architecture in capitalism is consumed as an image. The Starchitect's role isn't just to create a building, but a whole brand. Architecture becomes about branding, image making, and creating desire for a product. Architects must support and celebrate the capitalist machine. Performance. Starchitects must market themselves as visionaries, artists, and geniuses. This requires them to perform as lecturers, artists, and salesmen. They must wow clients with their bullshit. Starchitects must communicate their cultural significance and prove how relevant they are to architecture. Often this is done through showing how architects' intent is expressed through the work of architecture.
Every work of architecture should be in natural light. And this particularly, because you were seeing works of art which are really poetry.
It was important to present architecture as modern art. This reframed architecture as fine art and not functional design. Even today, architecture is often taught in schools not as design, but as fine art. The Bilbao Effect. The Bilbao Effect is the result of Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum on the practice of architecture. Opened in 1997, it was such an iconic building that it rejuvenated the city of Bilbao as a tourist destination. The Bilbao Effect is the idea that an investment in an iconic work of architecture will uplift a city by restoring tourism and the image of the city. This led to creation of countless knockoff buildings the world over. Rarely did these wannabe Bilbaos match the iconic form or cultural significance of the original. For over 20 years, Starchitecture was considered the most culturally relevant and significant works of architecture. Only in the last 5 years has the foolishness of the Bilbao Effect been rejected by the architectural profession. With an overview of what Starchitecture is, let's now ask, who are the top 10 Starchitects? Top 10 Starchitects. Number 10. Bjarke Ingels, Big. Bjarke Ingels is a Danish architect and founder of Bjarke Ingels Group, or BIG. Their website is Big Dick. The persona he cultivates is one like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, an innovator and futurist. His buildings are generated from formalism and conceptualism. He designs buildings through an abstract 3D spatial diagram. Although his building forms are derived from modern architecture, the focus on diagrams make him a purely postmodern architect. His use of diagrams is similar to Peter Eisman if Eisman was restricted to only using SketchUp. Or perhaps a better analogy is to Keith Haring's pop art. To understand Bjarke Ingels, one must understand the role of diagrams in modern architecture. Modern architects took diagrams of abstract forces such as movement, adjacency of functional space, and other elements and turned them into buildings. This was seen to be scientific problem solving, the same way a physicist uses mathematical models to describe the universe. This was taught at the Bauhaus, Harvard, and many other modern architecture schools. But in postmodern architecture, this method was derided as the decorated diagram, where architects were decorating diagrams with architectural elements such as walls, roofs, and doors. In postmodernism, the diagram changed from being functional and scientific to being an architectural language and poetry. Architects still created diagrams, but these were purely to create form, not related to function in any way. One can see this in Bjarke Ingels' diagrams that show space and building form purely as architectural diagrams. There is a geometric language of forms, but unlike modernism, have no relationship to the functional requirements of the building. Stephen Holl. Stephen Holl is a New York-based American architect. He designs using watercolor sketches where he develops abstract concepts and forms. His approach is both conceptual, theoretical, and formal. He also uses the architectural theory of phenomenology to add depth to what would be a purely formal exercise. But like all postmodern art, the concept always comes first and is the main driving force for the form of the building. Stephen Holl uses watercolor sketches to come up with the poetic concepts and turn them into architectural diagrams. His buildings are built diagrams based on watercolor sketches. This is very similar to what Bjarke Ingels does, but where Ingels uses the computer to design diagrams, Holl uses watercolors. In order to be relevant as art, architecture must be an abstract diagram or concept removed from reality and distinct from the functional requirements of the building. Architecture must be abstract postmodern art. Stephen Holl won the AIA Gold Medal in 2012. Number 8. Peter Zumthor. Peter Zumthor is a Swiss architect whose style is modern minimalism. Like Stephen Holl, he is influenced by the theory of phenomenology, believing architecture must be physically experienced. He tries to focus on phenomena like light, space, and materiality. Although Zumthor is a Starchitect, he is perhaps the most humble and low-key of the bunch. He tries not to rely purely on image making like the other architects on this list, but like other Starchitects, he is a formalist and theorist. His buildings are much deeper than one-line images and are more atmospheric, yet they are conceptual nonetheless. Peter Zumthor won the Pritzker Prize in 2009 and the Reba Gold Medal in 2013. Herzog De Meuron. Herzog De Meuron is a Swiss-based architecture firm of Jacques Herzog and Pierre De Meuron, founded in 1978. Not only do they experiment with iconic forms as other Starchitects, they also experiment with surfaces and materials such as silkscreen glass. Often they partner with fine artists in their work. They are one of the capitalist Starchitects who often do large-scale projects. Herzog De Meuron won the Pritzker Prize in 2001. Number 6. Thom Mayne, Morphosis. Thom Mayne is an American architect, theorist, author, and teacher based in Los Angeles. In 1972, Mayne helped found the Southern California Institute of Architecture, or SCI-Arc. He is a principal of Morphosis Architects in Los Angeles. Unlike other architects whose main influence is European modernism, he draws his inspiration from California architecture and the art world in general. His style is deconstruction. He considers himself as countercultural and radical and tries to present himself as an outsider and the bad boy of architecture. Like the Marlon Brando of architecture, he is too cool to be part of the establishment. Thom Mayne won the Pritzker Prize in 2005 and the AIA Gold Medal in 2013. Number 5. Rem Koolhaus. Rem Koolhaus is a Dutch architect, writer, and theorist. He is a teacher, often teaching at Harvard University. His most famous book is Delirious New York. He is a main proponent of deconstruction and post-structuralism and uses this theory to design buildings. He started the firm OMA, Office of Metropolitan Architecture, in 1975. He was joined by his former student Zaha Hadid, who would go on to start her own practice, arguably far more successful and creative than her teacher and mentor. When we say Rem Koolhaus uses architectural theory to design buildings, what do we mean? Deconstruction has its roots in post-structuralist theory and is a rejection of structuralism. But how does this translate into architecture? For the design of the Seattle Public Library, Koolhaus tried to deconstruct the Dewey Decimal System. The Dewey Decimal System is the foundational organization of libraries and structures knowledge in books into 10 main classes: computer science, information and general work, philosophy and psychology, religion, social sciences, language, technology, arts and recreation, literature, history, and geography. Koolhaus tried to deconstruct the Dewey Decimal System and reorganize the books in the library. It takes a certain type of arrogance to destroy a client's program and the very structure of knowledge itself. He organized the Dewey Decimal System on a spiraling ramp that spiraled throughout the building. To find a book, you couldn't just go to a specific floor of the building, but must walk around a labyrinthian, multi-story spiral. This had the effect of deconstructing the clear hierarchy of the Dewey Decimal System, flattening it into a single plane, looping it into a spiral. Koolhaus takes the architectural diagram and throws out the functional logic behind it. In post-structuralism, the sign is deconstructed and separated from its meaning. In architecture, the architectural diagram is deconstructed and separated from its use. Rem Koolhaus won the Pritzker Prize in 2000. Number 4. Zaha Hadid. Dame Zaha Hadid was an Iraqi-born British architect, artist, and designer. She is perhaps the greatest female architect ever. Her style comes from experimental architectural drawing influenced by Russian constructivism and deconstruction. She was deeply influenced by the Russian painter Kazimir Malevich. She is called the Queen of the Curve for her use of curvilinear geometry. Zaha Hadid is a pure formalist. Earlier in her career, she created a series of abstract, deconstructionist paintings. Her sense of space and form come directly from these studies. She uses painting as a design tool and a way to abstract space and form. She studied under Rem Koolhaus and after graduating worked for him at his firm OMA, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. Her later works were Neo-Futurist, like many of her British contemporaries. Zaha Hadid died in 2016. She won the Pritzker Prize in 2004. Number 3. Number 3 is a four-way tie between Norman Foster, Renzo Piano, Richard Rogers, and Nicholas Grimshaw. These architects are very similar in their works, so it was impossible for me to put one above another. In fact, Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers worked together to create the Pompidou Center in Paris. They all have a neo-futurist modern style that envisions some utopian high-tech future. It is a romantic fantasy for an industrial architecture. Sir Norman Foster is a British architect and designer. His style is futurist or high-tech modernism. His architectural practice, Foster and Partners, founded in 1967, is the largest in the UK. He collaborated with Buckminster Fuller on several projects earlier in his career. He started the architecture firm Team 4 with Richard Rogers in 1963. Foster worked with Steve Jobs to design the Apple Office Park and many Apple stores. His most iconic building is the Gherkin in London. Norman Foster won the Pritzker Prize in 1999 and the AIA Gold Medal in 1994. Renzo Piano is an Italian architect. He worked for Louis Kahn and others before starting his practice in 1971 with Richard Rogers. They designed the Pompidou Center together in Paris. He started his architecture firm Renzo Piano Building Workshop in 1981. His style is high-tech modern, or perhaps neo-futurist. When he's not trying to create iconic works of architecture, his buildings can be very refined and elegant, focusing on well-designed details. These could be considered modern buildings, but he has a postmodern streak to him as well, putting him on this list of Starchitects. Many of his buildings have a one-liner imagery to them. His California Academy of Sciences, for example, are two balls in a box with a green roof. This is clearly a formal and conceptual way to design a building. Renzo Piano won the Pritzker Prize in 1998 and the AIA Gold Medal in 2008. Richard Rogers is an Italian-British architect famous for his modernist and functionalist design. His design aesthetic is futuristic modern or high-tech modern. He is best known for his work on the Pompidou Center in Paris, Lloyd's Building, and the Millennium Dome in London. He worked for SOM in New York before partnering with Norman Foster. He went on to partner with Renzo Piano, then set up his own office, the Richard Rogers Partnership. Like Foster and Piano, his high-tech modern style looks to a utopian future where the good life is defined by technology and engineering. Rogers died in 2021. He won the AIA Gold Medal in 2019. Sir Nicholas Grimshaw is a British architect. He started a partnership with Terry Farrell in 1965 before starting his own firm, Nicholas Grimshaw and Partners, in 1980. As with Piano, Rogers, and Foster, his style is high-tech modern or industrial futurist. And like these other architects, there is a hopefulness that engineering and technology will save humanity. It is clear from the works like the Eden Project that he was deeply influenced by Buckminster Fuller. Like Renzo Piano, he is deeply concerned with the detailing of a project. Details show the hand of an architect in the design of a building, and expressing this shows the craft of architecture. Nicholas Grimshaw received the Royal Gold Medal in 2019. Number 2. Santiago Calatrava. Santiago Calatrava is a Spanish architect, structural engineer, sculptor, and painter. He is known for his bridges, railway stations, stadiums, and museums. His style comes directly from the Italian engineer and architect Pier Luigi Nervi. His sculptural forms often resemble living organisms. He works out his designs from watercolor sketches, much like Stephen Holl, making him a formalist in many regards. But he links his forms to structural diagrams, which is unique and interesting from an engineering point of view. This creates iconic structures as sculptural form. Calatrava was once a much-beloved architect in the 2000s, but recent construction problems with his buildings has tarnished his career, and after the Oculus in New York, was considered the most hated architect in the world. Santiago Calatrava won the AIA Gold Medal in 2005. Number 1. Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is a Canadian-born American architect and designer in Los Angeles. He established his practice in 1962. His works are considered among the most important in postmodern architecture and is perhaps the most important architect of our age. His buildings are juxtaposed collages of spaces and materials, directly inspired by Frank Stella's sculptures and collages. His architecture is a formalist experimentation of forms, spaces, and materials. His style, unlike many other architects, does not come from modern architecture, but rather comes from deconstructivist and postmodernist movements in sculpture and modern art. The overwhelming success of Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, created the Bilbao Effect in architecture. This created the category of Starchitecture, creating iconic and innovative architecture to revitalize cities. This has led to both good and bad architecture around the world. One of the most important effects on architecture Gehry has had is in the development of 3D software to design and build projects. Before Gehry, there was no way to design complex geometries in architecture without actually calculating their geometry. But Gehry's firm developed software that was used by other architects such as Herzog De Meuron and Zaha Hadid to create complex geometries. Without Gehry's pioneering work in 3D modeling, architects like Zaha Hadid would not exist. Frank Gehry won the Pritzker Prize in 1989 and the AIA Gold Medal in 1999. The Rejection of Starchitects. What is wrong with Starchitecture? Starchitects were much revered in the 2000s, but have now fallen out of favor, and some are downright hated. In recent years, there has been a rejection of Starchitects for more socially conscious architecture. The idea that architecture was created by a lone white male genius was challenged, and other forms of practice recognized. Architecture is an inherently collaborative field, and Starchitecture does not take this into account. The reduction of architecture to image making and branding was also rejected. Form making, for the sake of form making, was seen to create bad environments. Social consciousness in architecture. Architecture should create good environments for people to live, work, and play. It should not be to create brands and images for public consumption. The measure of good architecture shouldn't be how well it can be photographed, how good it looks in magazines, or how beautiful the rendering is. Rather, good architecture should focus on the lived experience of being in a space. Our world has deep social problems, and architects should be focusing their attention on solving these issues, not just developing iconic images. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another criticism of Starchitecture is its lack of diversity. Women have traditionally been excluded, Zaha Hadid being the notable exception. Starchitects have mostly been American, European, or Japanese men. This lack of alternative viewpoints in architecture is seen as a serious problem in recent years. The argument is the profession of architecture should promote justice, equity, and inclusion. Hopefully, architects will develop a more holistic and socially conscious practice in the future. What final conclusions can we take from the work of Starchitects? The way of working of Starchitects is profoundly similar, despite their apparent stylistic differences. In modernism, architects started with a client's program, functional requirements, and real phenomena. This created a need, and the architect's role was to problem-seek and problem-solve. In postmodern architecture, the idea of creating a functional building was thrown out. Instead of starting with clients' needs and problem-solve around them, postmodern architects started with concepts. These can be verbal or formal, words or images. The concept is always non-functional, related more to abstract art than to human or institutional needs. In this postmodern phase, high architecture is seen to go beyond a client's program to become abstract art. Architecture must be conceptual and exist beyond the functions of the building. The question of Starchitects remains. How does an architect be culturally relevant, market their work, win competitions and commissions without resorting to the tricks and one-liners of formalism in architecture? For this reason, it is important to understand how Starchitecture and postmodern architecture reduce the practice down to pure image making. What do you think? What are your favorite Starchitects? Did I miss any? Do you think Starchitecture is good for society? Or do you believe it's just a distraction from more socially responsible forms of architecture? What do you think comes next? I'm Jamie Roberts. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe.